Hello everyone, today's lecture will be talking about selection and speciation. Okay, this part of the population genetics lecture we did earlier, and it's kind of like an add-on to that lecture. Okay, again, this is my introduction with all my information, including my email if you ever want to get in contact with me with any questions or any concerns or anything like that. I also highly recommend you guys join the GroupMe. We'll be posting any updates or changes to scheduling or new events that we have there. It's also an easy way to get a hold of me or any of the other tutors, as well as many of the other students. If you have any questions or anything like that, there's a lot of people on there, and I'm sure somebody will know the answer. Okay, learning objectives for today. What is biometry and how is it used by biologists? I'll also be talking about what is polymorphism and how is it different from speciation. We're also going to talk about what is inbreeding and why is it generally worse than outbreeding. Okay, so moving on to the content. First, selection and speciation. So before we talk about how species adapt, we need to talk about how we actually track all of this information about species and populations as biologists. Biometry is the use of mathematics and statistical methods for analysis of biological systems, like, for example, population genetics. And this is how we get a lot of our information about the genetics and like species. And this is how a lot of these trees and everything is determined based on a series of mathematical and statistical models, methods, and analyses. However, biometry is used for a lot more than just population genetics. It's also very useful for medicine. It's very important to determine the effects of medication and therapies on targeting individuals. So all of this studies for new drugs, new therapies, new treatment methods, all of that uses a lot of statistics and mathematics to determine is it better than what we currently have? Is it statistically significant, and all of that, right? You don't really have to know too much about the actual statistical methods. You should know a little bit of like what is statistical significance and what is not. But generally, it's not, you don't have to know too deep, but you do have to know this is how we get a lot of our population genetic information. This is what we use for medicine and medical trials, clinical trials. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, let's actually talk about the genetics. So differential reproduction is very important, and it's the idea that certain groups of population leave behind varying numbers of offspring as opposed to each other. Essentially, in simplified terms, this means certain individuals in a group reproduce more than others. Some people have more kids than others in a population of animals, or actually any kind of organisms. This can apply to any type of organism. We track this, again, using statistical methods of biometry mentioned, and we determine which groups statistically reproduce more often, what the common factor leading to that is, and we try and figure out why is this particular group of people reproducing more often than their peers. And generally, the ones that reproduce more often are determined based on some kind of physical trait that they have, which is very often linked to a genetic gene. And that physical trait is deemed more fit or more well suited to survival. Again, it can be that for evolution and adaptation, we consider it what is more fit and more well suited to survival. But as for differential reproduction itself, it's more about what is deemed more fit, right? That'll typically get more mates. The person who is deemed more fit will get more mates and reproduce more often. However, there is also an aspect of which is actually more fit, because we're also tracking which ones have more surviving offspring, and generally the ones that are more fit first live long enough to reproduce themselves, because you can't reproduce as soon as you're born. You have to actually make it to maturity, and then their offspring also have to make it to maturity, and they have to actually survive long enough to be considered viable offspring. Okay. Next, let's talk about selection. So since one group of a population is reproducing more often than the others over a very long period of time, or more accurately, we're talking about animals, generally it's a long period of time. More accurately, it's after many, many generations of that animal or organism's life cycle. For example, if we're talking about humans, it's generally a very, very long time, because we live for a very long time. We have a very long lifespan. It takes long for us to actually get to maturity and have children of our own and have offspring. So it's generally a very long time for selection to occur. It takes many centuries. Whereas for something, and this is one of the reasons why we use so commonly fruit flies for genetic experiments, that for them, actually many generations could happen in months. In months, you could observe a significant difference because their life cycle is like weeks. So they reproduce very, very, very quickly, and you can go through many, many generations very, very quickly by our standards. So you could see the effects of selection relatively shortly. Okay. So over a long period of time, the majority of the population will be descendants of that one group. And so we'll most likely have similar genetics to those founders, at least in the trait that was selected for. And when we talk about selection, we're usually talking about in a trait or traits that are selected for. So yes, all of the genetics of that original founding group will be passed on to their offspring. But if that trait that they have, for example, like blonde hair, is not something that's selected for, all of the descendants after many generations may not have blonde hair, even though they were descended from that original founder group. And that's due to this third paragraph right here. Some of the offspring of that founder generation, they will not have inherited the selected trait, or they might not have inherited the selected trait. These members of the second gen will typically not reproduce as well as their siblings and cousins, which did inherit the trait. And so they will usually die off and not have offspring. And this will repeat every generation, so that some of the offspring which don't inherit the trait will simply not reproduce as well, or will die off, and they will not. And after many generations, it'll kind of like dilute itself out. So if, for example, again, let's go with blonde, I'll put in red, blonde versus brown is little b, and then is not the selected trait. And we have, we'll just say fit and not fit physically is small f. Over time, this person will have many offspring, whatever. And some of them may have something like this, where they have blonde hair and they're fit, and they're just like their father or whoever this is, who is also big B, big blonde and fit. And many of them will be like that. They'll be blonde, fit. But for example, one person will be brown haired but fit, and another person will be blonde, but they will not be fit. They'll have a little f. Right. So this person will have offspring. This person will have offspring. This person, because they are fit, will also have offspring. This person will not, he'll die. And now we have a new generation. Again, we'll blonde and fit, etc., etc. This one will have offspring. They'll be mostly brown-haired, fit. Brown-haired and fit. And so you can see if you just continue down like the same line, if you have any little f's, they'll essentially die off. If you have any little b's, which is brown hair, they won't die off because that's not the trait that's being selected for. So they'll usually continue and have more brown-haired kids, and eventually the population will be more or less have a ratio of blonde to brown hair. All right, this is a very simplified diagram, but this is just so you get the idea. Whereas the majority will have this big F, because if they don't, they'll die off, and after multiple generations of selection and kind of like a filtering process, most of the little f's will die off, and you'll be left with almost all big F's. Okay. And that's why certain traits are selected for, whereas others are not. And that's why after many generations, the entire population is not just a clone of the founding generation. They have slight differences because those differences were not selected for. Okay. And again, this is called selection. The gene responsible for the desired trait was selected for, and so it became more widespread among the population after many generations. That's the whole idea. Okay. What are the results of selection? So the main result of different selection among different populations over time is called speciation. For example, if there are two populations of the same species of jaguars in two different environments, and each population selects for different traits based on their environment. So say one trait select for white fur because they live in the snow, whereas another trait is for, I don't know, like yellow fur because they live in the sand and all the grass is yellow or something like that. Over time, over many generations, the one that's living in the Arctic will develop white fur, whereas the one that's living in the savanna will develop yellow fur. And they'll select for that over time, and any like white fur that are born into the savanna will die off. Any yellow fur that are born into the tundra will die off, and only the white will survive, versus all of the yellow fur will survive. And then over many generations, populations may be so different from one another that they are actually considered different species. Again, just fur color usually is not enough, but there's many other factors. Like for example, if the Arctic, they have to develop different types of teeth because they have different. They're hunting like small game versus in the savanna they're hunting big game. So they have to develop a different type of teeth or different type of legs for running. Instead of rather than like, I don't know, like jumping or crouching in the Arctic or something like that. These are just examples, but something like that. Develop different teeth, different legs, different fur color, different eyes, a lot of different factors. And eventually over time, they'll be so different that they're actually not even considered the same species anymore. And this speciation is the very basis of the phylogenetic tree, which we talked about in the population genetics lecture earlier on. I want to give like an example of the human phylogenetic tree. So this is kind of like what our, and remember, look, when I was talking about how long it takes, this could take like millions of years, right? Since we had these ancestors, this could happen over millions of years. This is not something that happens like over one generation, over 100 or even 1,000 years. Okay, and so here we are, Homo sapiens, right? And we're on this branch of the phylogenetic tree. At some point, like right here, which is about 1 million years ago, there was one type of ancestor that we had. It doesn't have a name here, but we'll say this is our HA, our Homo ancestor, I guess. And eventually, we had Homo sapiens living in. We had two groups of these HAs. One was living in, say, one part of Africa, and another was living in, say, another part of Africa, Europe or Asia. It doesn't matter, regardless. And over time, these two groups of HAs had to each had to adapt to their environment, and they underwent selection for different traits based on their environment, based on what animals or food was around them, based on everything like that. And eventually, these two groups of HA became so different from each other that they grew so different traits. One of them became known as Homo sapiens, and the other became known as Homo neanderthalis, or Neanderthals, we call them in simple terms. So humans and Neanderthals. And these two groups existed separately, but at the same time, at least for a period. And they are considered different species. We are considered different species than Neanderthals because we were considered different enough. And so that's why they're a different branch on the phylogenetic tree, right? And so right here is the speciation event. Actually, we'll change the color to purple. Right here in purple is the speciation event. It's the branch where the HA, the original ancestor, became so different between the two groups that they actually became classified as different species. This is kind of like a gradual process. So it's not like they birthed somebody and they were like, oh, this person is completely different than us, so this must be a Neanderthal. It's no longer an HA. Now this is a Neanderthal. And a person was birthed now, okay, this is a Homo sapien. This is not HA anymore. But it's kind of like more gradual, where they had little changes, little changes, little change, little change, little change, little changes. And then when you look back after all those little changes at the generation, you look like 10 generations back, and you're like, these are completely different. So it's no longer an HA, it's now a Neanderthal. Okay, it's more like that. Okay, so that's just an example with something that we're all familiar with, which is the humans. And you can see this happened multiple times. So again, before you had HA, you had this, I'll call it HAA for the ancestor's ancestor. And they developed into the HA, but they also developed into the erectus. And before that, we had this, and like all of these different branches. Okay. Next, let's talk about polymorphism, which is the kind of alternative to speciation. Speciation does not account for all differences between populations. There are some differences between populations that are still considered to be the same species, for example, and this is called usually polymorphism. Polymorphism is important because it breaks populations into distinct classes or groups, which have a specific difference. But this difference is obviously not one enough to be considered another species, but it's still a difference nonetheless. And kind of like the important thing about polymorphism is that it's usually, when we call polymorphism, it's usually referred to distinct classes rather than scale. For example, height is not really considered polymorphism because it's more like a scale, whereas something that is considered polymorphism is sex among animals. Most animals are either male or female, with very specific and perceptible differences in their traits and genetics. So, for example, you can clearly see they have different chromosomes, different reproductive organs, and different things like that. Between most animals, they have different sex. That's one polymorphism that we've developed. And again, not everything has polymorphism. For example, like plants don't really have that. Some of them are both male and female. And they kind of like reproduce with themselves between different parts of the plant. Bacteria definitely don't have sexes, right? Or viruses or other life forms. Other examples can include blood type in humans, right? Having A blood, B blood, AB blood, O positive, negative. Another example among animals is there are black versus yellow jaguars. They're still both jaguars and they can still mate with each other, but they are visibly different. One has black fur, one has yellow fur. Different patterns on butterfly wings. So even butterflies of the same species might have different patterns on their wings, depending on which area they're from. So differences like that. And this is how you can, this is kind of an example of like the jaguar that I was talking about. There's the yellow fur, black fur. You can see they're both the same species. They can both mate with each other. They look, other than the color of their fur, they look pretty much identical. But some have a light morph versus a dark morph. Okay, next let's talk about specialization and inbreeding, right? First, let's talk about specialization. As organisms select more and more for specific traits that were deemed fit for their environment, they become more specialized in a specific task. For example, many of us know about the finches Darwin observed, which inspired his theory of evolution, how they all had different beaks for eating different kinds of food. Some were for nuts, some were for seeds, some were for fruits. They all had different beaks that were specialized for different tasks. And these tasks were things that other finches with different types of beaks could not really do as well because they weren't specialized for it. And generally, as traits are more fit, they're usually go to become more specialized. But sometimes some adaptation may be to unspecialized, right? For example, a species of finch that can only eat nuts due to their beak may over time adapt to develop a more generalist beak, capable of eating fruits and seeds, as well as the cause of not being as effective as opening nuts. This could happen if, for example, there's like a nut shortage, or they change environments to one where there's no nuts, or there's like another animal that is introduced into the island, new species that's introduced to the island that also eats nuts, and they kind of have competition for this food source now. So it's not as effective to just focus on this one food source now, and they have to branch out. Over time, many of the birds of the finches that only eat nuts will die off because they don't have enough food, whereas the ones that develop more generalized beaks will kind of be able to get some fruit and some seeds as well, and they won't die off, and they'll reproduce more often. And that trait will be more selected for. Okay, this is kind of like an example of the finches. So this is the different like classifications: tree finches, warblers, ground finches. There's the different types of bills that they have, or bills or beaks or whatever they're called. And this is what these beaks are specialized in eating. So the grasping and the probing are for insects. These are for seeds. These are for fruits. And you can see how they're all mildly different. Okay. Okay. Next, let's talk about inbreeding versus outbreeding. Inbreeding refers to mating between partners that share a close genetic relation, like for example, siblings, cousins, things like that, like a close, genetic relationship or like blood relationship. Generally, from a genetic standpoint, it's very risky and often leads to offspring with many defects as compared to outbreeding, which is what we consider normal mating, which breeding between partners with little to no genetic relation. That's kind of like more accepted and more like standard for us, at least. And there is a reason for it, is because inbreeding is generally not, like I said, very risky from a genetic standpoint. While this does go against certain aspects of selection and adaptation, for example, as crosses between siblings would yield an increased chance of offspring inheriting a selected trait. So if we're going to talk about like finches, for example, if they had this like the cactus ground finch, which had this like cactus eating finch, and then you needed to develop that and get that going because you needed to select for that. Sorry, you needed to select for that because there's an abundance of cactus and not a lot of other foods, and you need to develop that. It would make sense for siblings maybe that have this trait from their parents to maybe mate with each other so that their offspring, they could have a lot of offspring which have this cactus eating bill, and their offspring will be more fit and more likely to survive. But there are many other drawbacks that actually make this more riskier than beneficial, right? So one big risk factor with inbreeding is mutations in an ancestor. Like mentioned in a lot of previous lectures, mutations occur much more often than you may expect. Our cells reproduce a lot, and because of that, they have to go through a lot of DNA replication, which is prone to making mistakes. We have a very good proofreading system to make sure there's not a lot of mistakes, but with how much we reproduce over the course of a lifetime, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. You're going to have a lot of mutations in your cells, and that's why as people get older, the risks for things like genetic disease, like cancer, diabetes, a lot of like heart conditions, like a lot of that stuff increases because over time your DNA gets more damaged and more damaged and more damaged, and now it's not producing what it needs to produce as well anymore, or it's producing too much of something or something like that. And sometimes if these occur in a germ cell, they can get passed down to offspring. So if you have, for example, a mutation in when you're 50 in your liver, there's no risk of your kids getting this genetic disorder, right, from you if you have that mutation that developed when you're 50. But if you have a mutation that occurred in a germ cell and for example, like in your sperm, and then that was used to create a child, that child would then have that mutation that occurred in you, right? And this is why things like we do genetic analysis to determine which people have like mutations and whatnot that they could pass down to their kids. This is typically not a huge issue if the mutation is masked or diluted with the wild type or unmutated or a healthier version of that gene from the other parent. However, because you get, remember, one copy of every gene from your mother, one from your father. If your mother had a mutation in hers and all of your genes from your mother have this mutation in your body, but all of the ones from your father are perfectly fine, they work perfectly, they can kind of like mask it or dilute it, and it's generally not as bad. And you only become like a carrier of that mutation from your mother. You don't actually express that mutation. However, if both of your parents have that mutation, which is often the case when your parents are siblings, then there's a much more increased chance of the offspring will suffer a birth defect. And this can happen even if your parents are not related. This does happen often, or relatively often, because there's a lot of mating that's without relation, without close relations, I should say. But even it's much less likely to happen if it's just two random people. Statistically, it's much less likely to happen if it's just two random people than if it's two people who are related. Because if they're related, that means they got it from your grandfather. And if they both got it from your grandfather, then you'll most likely have it. They'll both most likely have it. And then they'll most likely pass it on to you. And even if you don't express it, again, if you may continue mating with your sister or your cousin or whoever, close relation, it'll get passed down more and more and more and more, and it builds up, and eventually pretty much there's a high likelihood that all of your kids will have it. Some common birth defects that may develop include developmental defects, limb malformations, like we call it like a club foot, stillbirths and miscarriages, so the kids might not even be born, sterile offspring who may not have their own, be able to have their own children because they have either three X chromosomes or something like that, or there's some kind of chromosome misalignment or something like that. There's many others, right, that could happen. For example, like diabetes and things like that, type 1. There's plenty of bad mutations that could happen due to the inbreeding. This is a common picture of somebody that you probably have heard of. This is King Tut, who was an Egyptian pharaoh. This is a recreation of what he looked like based on genetic analysis. He's, I think in this picture, supposed to be like about like in his teens, like he's like 16, 17. So you can see he has very weak body, club foot. He had assumedly we assume developmental defects, as well as many other defects, and that's because his parents were, I think, either siblings or cousins or something like that. And among the pharaohs, inbreeding was very common because they wanted to like keep the bloodline pure, but it obviously backfired, and he had a lot of malformations and defects because of that. Another result of inbreeding, which could be considered positive or negative depending on the situation, is the enhancement of certain traits. Again, as the traits among close relations are very similar, certain traits will get passed down much more commonly, and some continuous traits, ones that have continuous traits are ones that have like a sliding scale rather than a yes/no. For example, height, skin pigmentation, etc. Those are continuous traits, right? And these will be enhanced from generation to generation. So, for example, if two very tall siblings were to inbreed, their offspring would also be very tall. The process continued among offspring for generations. Again, sibling, 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 sibling. Many generations later, the end result will be descendants who are much taller than their ancestors, assuming no birth defects, again, which is unlikely. After that many generations of inbreeding, it's very unlikely that they won't have some kind of birth defects that will actually like might hinder their growth or may hinder some other aspect, or they might even die or be sterile, which is unlikely, but this could happen and they'll be very tall. Most common example of this in history is actually, it's called the Habsburg chin. After many generations of inbreeding in the royal Habsburg family of Austria and Spain, which had a pronounced chin, ultimately led to a man named King Charles II of Spain, who is like the most well-known person with this deformity, or this trait, I should say. But I guess to his extent, it's a kind of like a deformity. This is kind of what he looked like, and you can see like he has a very malformed chin, and like it was to the point where he couldn't even like, he had to like swallow his food whole because he couldn't chew, and he had trouble speaking, and he had a lot of problems because of this. And the way this started was, again, there was a lot of incest among the royal family, keep the royal line pure, but for example, one person had a like a more pronounced chin, like not to his extent, but a little bit, and then they mated with their sister or cousin or whatever, who also had that same chin, but again, not as extreme. Their kid also had that, maybe to an even more extent, a little bigger extent. Their offspring had that, they mated again, and it kept going, and get more and more and more pronounced because the trait kept getting passed on and on and on. Okay, and eventually it led to this. Okay, so that's about most of what we want to talk about with population genetics. Like I said, we did a lecture on this earlier. Thank you very much for joining us. Hopefully this was helpful in kind of like getting like an understanding of why things like inbreeding are usually viewed negatively, as well as what speciation, selection, are polymorphism, the difference between that and speciation. If we got a little more accustomed to that. Thank you very much and have a great day.